Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive? Today we're tackling some really interesting concepts in Turkish history. Terms like shaman, Tengri, the steppe, nomadism.
Yeah.
All these words we hear but, might not fully grasp.
Absolutely.
And how they relate to Turkish history.
It's more than just definitions.
Right.
It's about understanding how these ideas have been shaped, by Western perspectives.
Yeah.
And what that means for how we view Turkish history.
Yeah, that's what we're going to explore. Our main source for this deep dive is an interview with Ahmet Demirhan, author of Shaman and Tengri, a critique of steppe historiography.
Interesting.
And I got to say, some of his arguments really challenge my own assumptions about Turkish history.
It definitely makes you think, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the first things he tackles is this field of study called Turkology.
Right.
Which focuses on Turkic peoples and cultures. And it's fascinating because Turkology emerged within this broader Western academic tradition called Orientalism.
Exactly. It's not just about, Turkish scholars studying their own history. It actually developed as part of this broader European movement, almost an obsession with classifying languages and cultures.
So these scholars were trying to put cultures in these neat little boxes based on language.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
But is that really a neutral thing?
Well, that's exactly what Demirhan questions, you see. He points out that these categories often reflect existing power dynamics.
I see.
And biases.
Like hierarchy.
Exactly.
Of civilizations.
He even compares this attempt to define the limits of language to how the philosopher Kant tried to define the limits of reason.
Okay, I like where this is going. So how did Turkology develop within Turkey itself? Was it just mirroring this European approach?
Not exactly. It went through different phases. Early on, Turkish scholars were mostly focused on trying to, control and reinterpret the knowledge that European scholars had already produced about ancient Turks.
So they were reacting to how outsiders were presenting their history.
Exactly. Later on, there was a push for more autonomy. Developing unique Turkish perspectives within the field. But this was interrupted by political events like the 1960 coup.
Wow. So we see how academic study can be intertwined with political power and social change.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got Turkology emerging within this framework of Orientalism. What's the big takeaway for us, for anyone trying to understand Turkish history?
Well, Demirhan argues we need to be aware of how these Western lenses might have shaped the way we see Turkish history, even today.
I see.
And one of the most striking examples he gives is this concept of the steppe.
Okay, the steppe, yeah. That's a pretty common term when we're talking about Turkish history. What's wrong with that?
Well, Demirhan's argument is that the steppe, as it's often portrayed, isn't really just a neutral geographical term. He actually calls it a fictional concept invented to dehistoricize the Turks and design them outside of history.
Whoa. So he's basically saying this whole image of the steppe is like a tool to write Turkish people out of history.
That's essentially it.
Yeah.
The way the steppe is often portrayed to, this vast empty space with these nomadic hordes wandering aimlessly reinforces the idea that Turks lacked a structured history until they were influenced by external forces.
Yeah, it creates this image of Turkish history as just this blank slate.
Exactly.
Waiting for outside forces to come and shape it.
And he contrasts this with how Western history is typically narrated.
Okay.
Right. In the West, we talk about the development of political organization from settled agricultural communities. But the steppe myth kind of flips this idea.
How so?
It suggests that political structures emerged first among nomadic peoples, driven by the need for a strong leader to unite these hordes.
So it's implying that Turkish political organization only comes out of this necessity, not through a gradual process of development.
Exactly.
It's like saying real history for Turkish people only began once they started resembling Western models of civilization.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And this brings us to another key concept, shamanism.
Okay.
It's often presented as this authentic element of Turkic history, almost like a romantic symbol of their ancient past.
Yeah.
But Demirhan argues that the concept of shamanism, as we understand it today, is actually a product of Western anthropology.
Hold on. You're telling me shamanism, which feels so connected to Turkish identity, is actually a Western construct.
That's exactly what he's arguing. You see, he traces it back to how early anthropologists tried to categorize what they saw as supernatural beliefs.
Okay.
And they lumped shamanism together with practices like witchcraft. viewing them as attempts by primitive people to understand the world beyond their physical senses.
So it's not that these practices didn't exist, but the way they were framed and categorized was shaped by Western perspectives.
Exactly. And this categorization wasn't innocent. By presenting shamanism as a relic of a more primitive past, it reinforced this idea of a hierarchy of civilizations.
With the West at the top.
Of course.
So it's like using anthropology to create this civilization ladder and putting certain cultures on the lower rungs.
Exactly. Now, how did Turkish scholars react to this? Well, Demirhan is actually quite critical of how some Turkish scholars have relied on Russian Orientalist sources when studying shamanism.
Oh, interesting.
He believes this has led to an uncritical acceptance of certain ideas like spirit journeys without really examining their origins and context.
Like a game of historical telephone where things get distorted along the way.
Precisely.
So we've got this Western lens shaping how we see the steppe and concepts like shamanism. Where does Tengri fit into all of this?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of how Western scholarship often frames history. Demirhan argues that this Western fascination with shamanism and Tengri is part of this broader search for origins.
We're always trying to find that first spark, right? Where it all began.
Exactly. But here's what's fascinating. While Western narratives often look for origins in a divine realm, the way the steppe is portrayed often places the origins of Turkish history outside of history altogether.
So instead of a divine beginning, it's a beginning in nothingness.
Right. And he argues that this ultimately serves to portray Turkish history as something vulgar and barbaric in the eyes of the West.
It feels like we've barely scratched the surface here, and I'm already questioning everything I thought I knew about Turkish history.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. It's clear we need to dig deeper into how these narratives impact modern Turkish identity. This is going to be fascinating.
I agree. This is where Demirhan's critique gets even more interesting. He challenges us to think about how these historical interpretations play out in the context of Kemalism.
Okay, now we're talking about history, identity, and politics.
It all comes together.
Yeah, this is where things get really complex.
Absolutely. And this is where we really start to see how these seemingly abstract historical debates have very real consequences for how Turkish identity is understood today. So, you see, Demirhan argues that these Western frameworks we've been talking about, like Orientalism, they really impact how we study and interpret Turkish history. He challenges us to think critically about the categories and labels we use. Like, for example, he argues that before modernity, there were Turkish legends, stories, epic poems. But not this field of study called mythology.
So you're saying that just because a story is old, it's not automatically mythology?
Exactly. We need, a framework, a methodology to properly study mythology. He compares it to other fields like anthropology, where you have specific methods for studying things like kinship relations.
So you need the right tools for the job.
Exactly. And he applies this same logic to the study of language. He believes that reducing the study of Turkish language solely to Turkish actually limits our understanding.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, he thinks that studying language more broadly, but using Turkish as a lens, can actually help us understand language in general better. We can, make more meaningful comparisons with other languages.
Like Turkish is the key to unlocking the secrets of other languages.
I love that. And he goes even further. He argues that we need to develop methods specific to Turkish to truly understand its unique structure and grammar. He's concerned that just applying Western linguistic methods might not capture the essence of the language.
Like trying to force a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. And he sees this tendency, to force external frameworks onto Turkish history and culture as a real problem in Turkology. He thinks it makes it difficult to really grasp the nuances of the material.
So what's the solution? How do we move beyond this?
Well, Demirhan thinks focusing on historiography can provide a clearer path.
Okay, historiography. Another academic term. Break that down for me.
Sure. Historiography is basically the study of how history is written. The different perspectives, biases that shape historical narratives.
Got it.
And through historiography, Demirhan can analyze and critique the materials produced by Turkology. It helps him identify those moments where Eurocentric biases and assumptions have crept in.
So recognizing that history is never truly objective.
Precisely.
It's always being filtered through different lenses.
Exactly. And Demirhan provides some fascinating examples of how this plays out in the way Turkish history is often presented. Remember our discussion about this step.
Yes, this idea that it's often portrayed as this empty, chaotic space with wandering hordes.
Right. Well, he argues that this portrayal allows Western historiography to conveniently place the origins of Turkish history outside of history itself.
Like, their story doesn't really begin until they come into contact with these more established civilizations.
Exactly. It's like they're stuck in this historical prologue, waiting for the real story to begin.
That's so dismissive.
It is. And he argues that this has real implications for how we understand the development of political and social structures in Turkish history.
Okay.
The Western narrative emphasizes the development of political organization from settled agricultural communities. But the steppe myth kind of flips that idea on its head.
How so?
Well, instead of political organization arising from settled communities, it suggests that political structures emerged first among nomadic peoples.
Okay.
Driven by this need for a strong leader to unite these hordes, right?
So it's like their political sophistication comes out of necessity, not this gradual process of development.
Exactly. And Demirhan points out this completely contradicts the way Western history is typically narrated.
Yeah, it's implying that Turkish history just deviated from the norm of how societies develop.
Right. And he takes this even further, looking how these narratives impact how we understand the formation of ethnic names and identities.
Okay. How do names get tied into all of this?
Well, because the steppe is presented as this empty space without a center. Yeah. He argues that Turkish ethnic identities are often portrayed as shaped by external forces, like reactions to other groups outside the steppe.
So their identity is formed in response to others.
Yeah.
Not through their own development.
Exactly. Like geography is destiny,
So the vastness of the steppe is dictating the fate of the people.
That's the critique he's making.
Yeah.
He wants to highlight the internal factors, the historical agency, that are often ignored in these steppe-centric narratives.
And this brings us back to shamanism.
Yes.
Okay, we talked about shamanism as this Western construct.
Right.
But how does that connect to this idea of the steppe?
He argues that the association of shamanism with Turkish history is rooted in this assumption that the most authentic representation of a culture is found in its most remote and isolated regions.
So the purest Turkish culture is located on the fringes, far from any outside influence.
Exactly. He's specifically talking about groups like the Yakuts in Siberia.
Okay.
Or those in the foothills of the Altai Mountains. Like, to understand real Turkishness, you have to go to the edges of the map.
Right.
And Demirhan really pushes back against this.
Yeah.
He argues that this fascination with the remote, with the exotic, is part of how European thinkers constructed this anthropological fiction around shamanism.
Anthropological fiction. I like that term. What does he mean by that?
He's saying that early anthropologists created this category of shamanism and lumped it together with other so-called supernatural beliefs like witchcraft as a way to explain how, quote-unquote, primitive people tried to make sense of the world.
It's a way to categorize and dismiss these practices as irrational or superstitious.
Exactly. And by creating this category of shamanism, they can reinforce this idea of a hierarchy of civilizations.
With the West at the top.
Of course.
So they're using anthropology to justify their own sense of superiority.
You got it. And he argues that this anthropological fiction was further reinforced through this process of ethnographic discovery.
When Western explorers and researchers went out to document these practices, it's like they're turning these cultures into living museums.
Right. And it seems a bit hypocritical considering how Russia was trying to present itself as this enlightened nation.
Yeah, the irony.
Right? They wanted to distance themselves from primitive practices like shamanism while simultaneously using them to define and other the cultures under their rule.
Power and control, even in this supposedly objective field of anthropology.
Right. And this brings us to another fascinating point, the origin of the word shaman itself.
Ooh, yeah, it sounds so ancient and mysterious.
Well, Demirhan actually traces the word back to its entry into European languages through, Russian and then German. He believes it emerged as part of this broader effort to define and categorize primitive cultures and gradually gained wider acceptance in academia.
So even the language we use to describe these practices is rooted in a specific Western historical and intellectual context.
Precisely. And Demirhan argues that this uncritical acceptance of the term shaman and its associated concepts has led to, a lot of misunderstandings.
Especially in how Turkish scholars have approached it.
Exactly. He's talking about that over-reliance on Russian sources we discussed earlier. He believes this has resulted in the uncritical acceptance of ideas like spirit journeys without fully understanding their context and origins.
Like that game of telephone again.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not about rejecting the study of shamanism altogether, but approaching it with a more critical and independent lens.
Exactly. He emphasizes understanding the specific cultural and historical context in which these practices emerged, rather than viewing them through this predetermined Western framework.
This makes me think about all the assumptions we bring to the study of history.
It's important to be aware of them.
Yeah, we need to question our own perspectives and biases constantly.
Absolutely. And Demirhan's critique doesn't stop there. He also delves into the concept of animism.
Okay, animism. That's the idea that inanimate objects and natural phenomena have spirits or souls, right?
Right. But he argues that this common understanding of animism as simply attributing, life to inanimate objects is a gross oversimplification.
Okay.
You see, he thinks there's a much deeper understanding of the psyche or the soul.
So it's more than just, ancient people thinking that trees and rocks had spirits.
Exactly. He suggests that there's this profound understanding of the relationship between the physical and spiritual realms at play.
I see.
And he thinks this deeper understanding is often lost in translation when Western scholars try to, categorize and interpret animistic beliefs.
Like trying to explain quantum physics using Newtonian mechanics?
I love that. And he believes that this failure to grasp the nuance of the soul in these traditions has led to some pretty strange claims in the study of shamanism.
Like what kind of claims?
Well, he mentions the work of Ahmet Okak, a Turkish scholar who's written a lot about shamanism. Demirhan criticizes Okak for not fully grasping this concept of spirit in shamanic practices, which leads him to promote ideas that Demirhan considers superstitious, even though Okak claims to be doing scientific research.
So it's like mistaking poetry for a scientific textbook.
That's a great way to put it. And he contrasts this with the work of Abdülkadir Anan, another Turkish scholar, who later in his career actually admitted that he had made a mistake by relying so heavily on Russian Orientalist sources.
So even within Turkish scholarship, there's this push to move beyond these Western frameworks.
Exactly. There's a growing awareness of the need for more independent, more critical perspective.
That's encouraging.
Yeah. And this leads us back to Tengri.
Right, Tengri. Often understood as this sky god in ancient Turkic belief systems.
Right.
How does Demirhan connect this back to his larger critique?
Well, he links this Western fascination with shamanism and Tengri back to this broader search for origins.
That quest for the roots of civilization.
Exactly. And remember how he pointed out that Western narratives often seek these origins in the divine?
Yeah.
Well, he contrasts this with how the steppe myth functions.
By placing the origins of Turkish history outside of history itself.
Precisely. It's like saying Turkish history begins in this void, this ahistorical nothingness.
Yeah.
And he believes this ultimately serves to portray Turkish history as something, vulgar, barbaric in the eyes of the West.
It's undermining the legitimacy and complexity of Turkish history.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground. We've explored how concepts like the steppe, shamanism, and Tengri have been shaped by Western scholarship. And it's clear we need to be really careful about the assumptions we bring to the study of history.
Always.
Yeah, so what are Demirhan's thoughts on how all of this impacts our understanding of modern Turkish identity?
That's a great question. And it's where Demirhan's insights become even more relevant. He encourages us to think about how these historical narratives play out in the context of Kemalism.
Okay, now we're talking about the intersection of history, politics, and national identity. This is where things get really interesting.
Absolutely. And this is where we start to see how these seemingly abstract historical debates have very real consequences for how Turkish identity is understood and constructed today.
Okay, so we're getting into Kemalism now. This is where we see how all these historical narratives we've been talking about actually impact Turkish identity today.
Right. And Demirhan really pushes back against this idea that any attempt by Turkish society to define itself against the West is automatically a form of self-colonization.
Self-colonization. Okay, I've heard that term before.
Yeah.
To colonize people, internalizing the values of their colonizers even after independence.
Right, like inheriting colonial thinking. But Demirhan argues that we need to be careful about applying that concept too broadly.
Okay.
He reminds us that true colonization and Orientalism are Western concepts.
So just because Turkish society might have adopted some Western ideas or practices, that doesn't mean it's a sign of, like, internalized oppression.
That's the nuance he's bringing in.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that simply modernizing or incorporating Western ideas doesn't mean Turkish society has completely internalized a colonial mindset.
So how does he suggest we think about Turkish identity then, especially in relation to Kemalism?
He calls for a more nuanced approach.
Okay.
One that moves beyond this simple binary of pro-West versus anti-West.
I see.
He wants to acknowledge the agency and resistance that have always been present in Turkish history, even when engaging with the West.
So it's like Turkish history isn't just reacting to external forces, but it has its own internal logic and cultural expressions driving it.
Exactly. And he highlights how Kemalism, while it drew inspiration from Western models, also tried to forge a distinctly Turkish path to modernity.
It wasn't just blindly copying.
Right. Think about how Kemalism emphasized pre-Islamic Turkish history.
Yeah.
He sees this as an attempt to synthesize those Western ideas with elements of Turkish culture.
Okay, but earlier we talked about how concepts like the steppe and shamanism were shaped by Western scholarship.
Yeah.
How did Kemalism deal with that?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that Kemalism used pre-Islamic Turkish history as a way to assert a unique Turkish identity, separate from the Ottoman past.
Right.
Part of building a modern Turkish state.
So looking back to forge a new national identity.
Exactly. But Demirhan also points out that this embrace of pre-Islamic history wasn't always, critical or nuanced.
I see.
He argues that some aspects were distorted or simplified to fit this narrative of a strong Turkish nation.
It's history being rewritten for a political agenda.
You could say that. And it's important to remember that many scholars have critiqued how Kemalism, in its push for modernization, sometimes overlooked or suppressed elements of Turkish culture and history that didn't fit its vision.
History is always being written and rewritten.
Right, to serve the needs of the present.
So where does Demirhan want to take us with all this? What's the point of his critique?
He's calling for a more honest and complex engagement with Turkish history. He wants to move beyond these simple binaries, like pro-West or anti-West, and recognize the unique ways Turkish society has interacted with Western ideas.
It's not a simple story of resisting or embracing the West.
Right, it's much more dynamic.
Yeah.
He wants us to acknowledge those moments of accommodation and resistance often happening together.
Yeah.
Look at how Turkish intellectuals and leaders have grappled with Western thought throughout history.
So we need to look deeper, see how Turkish culture has adapted.
Exactly. And he gives this really compelling example from the Ottoman period.
Okay.
The development of a Turkish style.
Turkish style, what's that?
He describes it as a fusion of influences. Elements of Arabic, Persian, even Western traditions.
Okay.
Blended together, but still retaining a Turkish character.
So not purity or isolation, but creatively blending influences.
Exactly. And he stresses that this wasn't just imitation.
Yeah.
It was a genuine fusion, reflecting a deep engagement with the world.
That challenges this idea that Turkish culture was static before Western influence.
Right. It was already dynamic and evolving.
Yeah.
To illustrate this, Demirhan shares a beautiful quote. "We have no hands, no waist, no tongue, but we walk around the world like men."
Wow, that's powerful. It speaks to resilience, adaptability, confidence.
And that's the spirit he wants to capture. This ability to adapt, synthesize, forge something new that's essential to understanding Turkish identity.
It's not about clinging to some fixed idea of Turkishness.
Right.
But recognizing that culture is always evolving.
Exactly. Identity is never static.
This has been an incredible deep dive. It's really challenged me to rethink things and to appreciate Turkish culture in a new way.
That's the power of critical thinking, engaging with these ideas.
Absolutely.
It helps us understand the world better, appreciate its richness and diversity.
Yeah, it's given me a lot to think about. I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
There's always more to uncover.
Yeah.
More perspectives to consider.
That's the exciting part.
It is. This ongoing process of discovery.
So as we wrap up, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do you hope they'll take from this conversation?
I hope they'll leave with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to question the narratives they encounter about different cultures and histories, explore Ahmet Demirhan's work, and discover the richness of Turkish history for yourself.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought. How might recognizing the Western construction of concepts like Shaman and Tengri lead us to a more nuanced understanding of Turkish history and identity? Keep diving deep,